Alright, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how the flipping actually worked in the classes that we saw there at Stony Point High School in Round Rock. And like I said in the previous video, that was the key to making this whole thing work was how they did it. Okay, so first of all, the students did not have to watch the videos for homework. They did make videos. They were required to watch them, but they were not required to watch them for homework. In fact, it was completely expected that the students would watch the videos in class. All right. Each classroom had a cart of about, I don't know, about 10 laptops maybe. Now I know you're thinking, oh gosh, well we're going to have laptops, but no, not necessarily. Okay. Some of their classes were larger than others, and I didn't see any, in any of the classes that we visited, I didn't see any of them where all the laptops were being used. I'd say maybe about a half a dozen at the most. Okay? Students were also using their own laptops, their own iPods, iPads, or phones to watch the videos. So it's one of these bring your own technology, you can use it. So technology was not a roadblock to making this flipping work. Okay, they didn't have to watch it at home, so they didn't have to have it at home. They were watching it in class, and even if you're going, gosh, I've only got 3 computers in my room, this can still work, I promise. Especially if you have students who can bring their own things into the classroom, their own technology. So first of all, they didn't have to watch them for homework. They watched them in class. Okay. After that, the class structure was mostly self-paced in what you may know of as blended learning. Thanks to Ms. DeBose for telling me about blended learning is something that she had been trained on in the past. And when I look at what blended learning is, this is exactly what was going on in these classrooms. Okay. The students had packets that they picked up when they began a unit. They worked through those, they watched the videos, worked through the packets, did the lab investigations, all on their own and self-paced. Some of them worked together in groups, some of them by themselves, but they had control. Okay, it was totally them working through the work that the teacher had assigned. The teacher was there to help, but the teacher was not standing in front of the classroom, at any given time, maybe for a few minutes at each period. Okay. When they were working in their packets, when they got finished to a certain point, they would have to go get the teacher's approval before they could move on to something else. Okay. So let's say they'd watch the videos, and then they had some problems they had to solve or some questions they had to answer. Well, they couldn't move on to the next part until the teacher had given his or her approval. And to do that, the teacher would take a look at the students' work and see how they had answered the questions, and then the teacher would ask questions. Okay? So, for instance, if they were learning about, they were learning about, when we were there, about chemical equations and balancing chemical equations. So the teacher would start out with a fairly simple knowledge-based question, and then he would work up to some more difficult questions. And for those of you who have been required to use the strongest questioning, this was perfect for that. Okay? So depending on how the student answered, she may have sent the students back and said, no, you know what, I want you to work on number 4 and number 5 again. Try those again. I think you need to go over that again. Maybe go watch the second video again. And then once you've done that, come back to me and we'll talk again. But if they were answering the question satisfactorily, they would be allowed to move on. So the teacher's getting a formative assessment just by talking one-on-one to the student before they're ever able to move on to the next part of the lesson. And that was great. As they moved through the units, Mr. Veve had around one of his whiteboards on the wall, or bulletin board, he had what looked kind of like a racetrack, and he each of the students had a symbol that they put on that racetrack that represented them. And in fact, they were chemical symbols. And as they worked through the units in each lesson, they got to move their little symbol along. So it's a real easy visual way to take a look up there and see where everybody is. And it was kind of a, it helps out with how the students, how they like to compete with each other. Well, they'd look up there and say, "Ooh, look who's ahead! I'm behind. I need to catch up." It was really neat. So the students kept track of their own progress. Even lab investigations were done completely by students in stations at the back of the room. Okay, so the couple of investigations we saw, they were having to combine different chemicals and determine whether a chemical reaction had taken place. So, they're using chemicals that they needed to be careful with, but the teacher had explained the safety concerns, and they went back and did it all on their own. Now, if you have a station going, with the lab investigation, that might be the place where you need to spend most of your time that day just to watch out. But they really, it worked well. The students knew how to do it, and of course, you'd have to train your students on this from the very beginning of the year. But once you do, they were able to handle it just fine. So when the teachers approved completion of the work, the students were allowed to take the unit test. So they'd gotten through everything in that unit or that lesson. They'd answered the questions. They'd done the lab investigation. They may have had to write an essay or something. It just depended on what was going on in that unit. They may have had to solve some problems. But once they had completed everything in the packet and the teacher had asked them questions to check for their understanding at each different place, at each different stopping point in the unit, then they were allowed to take the test. Mr. Veve's tests were online, and Miss Angrisa's tests were not. But she had several versions of the test, so she wouldn't give all the students exactly the same test. They would go take the test. If they passed, they were able to move on. If they didn't like their grade, they could go back and redo part of the lesson and then try to take the test again and improve their grade. If they failed the test, well, then they were required to go back and work through a part of the lesson again. And then once they got finished with that, they could move on. Guidelines were given for when students, for when units were due based on the curriculum pacing. They would say, okay, Unit 1 has to be done by September the 12th. Unit 2 has to be done by September 24th. And if they weren't done with it, then they were allowed to fall behind a little bit, but their grades suffered if they were behind in the pacing. When we were in there, some students were working on Unit 12, and there was even one student all the way back to Unit 9, and he was trying to get her to catch up, and she was working really hard to do it. She was determined that she was going to do that so she wouldn't fail the year. So I don't know what had happened before, but she was behind, but she was making her way through it and not giving up. Like I said earlier, students who failed exams had to redo their lessons before taking their tests.